Here we go. So we are recording now, and we will be sharing the recording after the session, as well as any materials that were presented during the meeting. And if you have signed up to join any 3 of our sessions as part of the series, you will also be getting a summary recap of all the 3 sessions. So look out for that after next week. And today, this morning, we are going to be covering 2 topics. So Shelley, if you could forward to the next slide. We're going to start off with Emily Ennis, who is going to be covering some strategies for using local development tools through Redevelopment Authority. And then we are going to be turning it over to Atel to talk about her advocacy efforts in Worcester. And with that, I'm going to just quickly introduce Emily. Emily Ennis is the principal of Ennis Associates, and she has over 10 years of experience in planning and urban design. She was a planner with the Cecil Group when it was acquired by Harriman Associates in 2015 and became Harriman's Director of Planning in 2019, leading their urban design and planning studio. In 2020, Emily founded Ennis Associates to continue her work with communities of all sizes throughout New England. Her primary focus is land use and regulatory planning, including downtowns, urban renewal areas, waterfronts, and industrial areas. And our second speaker for the first session this morning is Atel Hajiai. Atel is City Councilor-elect, newly City Councilor-elect from the City of Worcester. As a climate and housing advocate, she has served in several local boards and committees, including the Community Development Block Grant Advisory Committee, the Citizens Advisory Council, and Advisory Committee on the Status of Women. Atel currently serves as Director of Public Education and Advocacy at the Central Massachusetts Housing Alliance. Welcome both to Emily and Atel. And with that, Shelley, if you could bring down the screen for session 1, and we're going to turn it over to Emily.
Great, thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen. And once I get that up there, hopefully you can all see that. So as Christine said, my name is Emily Ennis, and today I'm going to talk to you primarily about one of my specialties, which is urban renewal plans. Talk to you a little bit about how the Redevelopment Authority and urban renewal plans work, what their role in housing is, some of the examples from some of the plans I've worked on, and some steps that you all can take if you either have redevelopment authorities or are thinking about redevelopment authorities. So redevelopment authorities are enabled under Chapter 121B of the Massachusetts General Laws. You can see the language up here on that top paragraph. That basically every city or town can have a redevelopment authority. It has to be authorized either by the Board of Selectmen or Select Board in a town or City Council in a city, and that it has certain specific powers, which we're going to go through today. Interestingly enough, for our conversation about housing authorities are also enabled by the same legislation, and a housing authority in a town that does not have a redevelopment authority can act as a redevelopment authority if certain conditions have been met, requiring authorization from municipal officers or a special town meeting. An area in which they're working, if you're doing an urban renewal plan, has to meet certain definitions for blighted open areas or decadent areas. We're not going to go through those definitions today, but just be aware that you can't just start work, you have to do some planning as well. I do want to emphasize, obviously, this is a Gateway Cities call, so I'm assuming the majority of you are from city organizations, but there is a difference in how redevelopment authorities are created and how the members are appointed based on whether or not you are a city or a town. In the case of a city, the redevelopment members are appointed by the mayor. One member appointed by DHCD or by the governor. The towns, they're actually elected, and that can present some interesting challenges if the elected officials in a town are not on the same page in terms of redevelopment. In a city, obviously, the assumption is that the redevelopment authority and the city government are in are moving towards the same goals in terms of redevelopment. So that's just something to remember. And it's especially important with development because you have both, as I'm sure you're all aware, both political risk and time risk when you're dealing with development. So let's talk about the actions a redevelopment authority can take. Primarily, its role is, and the reason it's called a redevelopment authority is because we're talking about the development of land here. And that's not something that a city council or a board of selectmen, select board are really set up to do. They have other roles within a city, but the redevelopment authority's primary role is that development of land. And it's a development of land to address those conditions of blight, which is why it's so important to have the definition in there. And as a redevelopment authority, they have authority over different aspects of land use and land use development. So they can do financing, receiving grants and loans and other funds. They can also borrow monies. They can acquire, and a lot of people talk about redevelopment authorities and eminent domain, and eminent domain is certainly a tool that can be used, but it's not the tool of first resort. So knowing that a redevelopment authority can also purchase land, it can lease land or buildings, it can get them from a grant. Certainly some of the plans I've worked on, city-owned land has been transferred or would be transferred over to the redevelopment authority. So eminent domain is not the only tool in terms of the acquisition of land. They can also clear and improve the property. So there's actions that the redevelopment authority can take itself to deal with the property once it has it. And it can also lead the construction or reconstruction. Now, with that, it can also dispose of property, and we're going to talk about the disposition of property in a minute, but just understanding that can dispose of property both by lease, but also by sale. And in terms of housing, that becomes an interesting feature of what a redevelopment authority can do. So overall, they have the power to plan and they have the power to build. And that, again, in thinking about how we're trying collectively to respond to the housing crisis, those are two important components. So my focus up to date in urban renewal has really been about creating conditions for the private market to act. And that's very different from the urban renewal in the 60s, 70s, even back to the 50s in some areas, where at the time it was very much focused on top-down planning and planning where they were looking at clearing and reconstructing whole areas of a city. And interestingly enough, and much of the work that I've done, some of what we're doing is actually reacting against what had happened in the 50s and 60s. Certainly that happened in Lawrence, where we kicked off our planning process with a discussion involving people who had fought against urban renewal in the 60s and 70s. And here we were starting a new urban renewal plan. So the history of urban renewal very much came to the forefront. In Fall River, again, some of the work that I did was trying to sort of address things that had happened in urban renewal in these grand schemes on a much smaller scale. But in all of those, we had these tools of regulatory controls, acquisitions and dispositions, public infrastructure and public open space. And primarily these plans were focused on the public actions that would allow private investment to come into the city and make certain changes. So in Lawrence, we were looking at acquisition, permitting, and development, regulatory changes, interestingly, financial and technical assistance for property owners to help them do their own development, and then public infrastructure improvements. And many of these themes went into the Fall River downtown and the Fall River waterfront. One difference between Lawrence and Fall River, and you see that at the top of the two Fall River plans, is organizational activities. So making sure that the city has the staff necessary to assist, or the redevelopment authority has the staff necessary to assist with the requirements of the plan in terms of implementation. These are plans that are very much focused on things that can happen. And so making sure that the organizational structure is there for that to work is critical. In terms of housing, again, the focus of these three plans weren't so much on the city doing the housing, but there were some important tools for the private market that these plans anticipated, and I wanted to call those out. So in Lawrence, we overlaid the portions of the urban renewal area with a 40R smart growth overlay district, and then tied the 40R payments that would come through to home ownership assistance programs. So the idea was to, yes, have the private market do the development, but have the monies coming from that development start to move into addressing some of the home ownership needs in the city. All three of these had some form of design guidelines, again, to help control the development and the appearance of the development within the city. Lawrence also added a historic district or the preparation of a historic district for Essex Street to address the capital stack for the private market, helping to do redevelopment, and that would include housing, a bilingual permitting guide and pre-permitting meetings to make it easier for property owners to come in and redevelop. In the Fall River downtown, we were really looking at infill development and the catalytic projects that could happen there. But one thing that addressed housing was changing the boundaries of the zoning so that more of the downtown was within higher density residential districts rather than the lower density districts that they were in. So this is a strategy to bring more housing into downtown, which I know a lot of gateway cities have been wrestling with. But again, the catalytic projects were meant to be private investment. And then in the waterfront, this was one of the more unusual plans in that the proposed regrading of Route 79, which is currently an elevated highway, down to grade level, opened up about 10 acres of new land. And so in looking at the land that would become available for development, this plan was really about what to do with that land and how to plan in advance of that coming in. And a lot of that was the redevelopment authority acquiring that land and then disposing of it for mixed use development, again at higher residential densities with the mix of uses on the ground floor level. It was also about reconnecting the neighborhoods, the existing neighborhoods, most of which were 2 to 3 family housing, back down to the waterfront, and extending the improvements and the street improvements into those neighborhoods. So while it wasn't about the creation of new housing in those neighborhoods, it was about making those neighborhoods better integrated into the rest of the city, into the waterfront. In Brockton, I've been working a little bit more smaller scale in terms of development. And this one was an area of open land next to the downtown, a former rail yard. And where housing comes into this is they had a neighborhood on this side, mostly well-established, but cut off by the area of this former rail yard from being connected to the rest of the city. So we looked at 2 forms of housing: multifamily residential to take advantage of its location next to their transportation center, which was both regional bus and the commuter rail. This is Brockton's downtown rail station, is right down here. Up here, we looked at a strategy that I think a lot of communities are starting to look at, where the current zoning for single family housing is not matching what was actually built. So the requirements for lot size, the requirements for setbacks actually don't meet what's there now. You couldn't build the small neighborhood that's there now under the current zoning. So we recommended that the zoning change to allow for an infill neighborhood to connect the existing neighborhood, those smaller housing sizes, which by dint of being smaller would be more affordable to the area. We're also currently working on a land use plan in Brockton that's likely to turn into an urban renewal plan. In this case, we're looking at a mixed use district of manufacturing, primarily life sciences. You can see those in the brown buildings in the back, office and lab space. But along Oak Street here on the right-hand side, the northern side, you see a lot of taller gray buildings. These are multifamily districts. And so we're looking at tying those multifamily with multifamily new mixed use and multifamily across the street that really integrates a component of jobs and the ability to live next to those jobs. In both areas in Brockton, these sites are actually both bisected by brooks. And so the urban renewal plan looks at how the public intervention is creating amenities for housing, current and future residents, and employees, by also addressing climate change and the likelihood of these brooks flooding. So that is the public intervention that then allows the private market to come in and do this mixed use development. So again, all of these plans were much larger plans, much more about the public infrastructure improvements, the regulatory changes that could be made to allow for private development to come in. But I want to pause it for discussion today and for the work that you all are doing, this idea that redevelopment authorities can have a direct role in housing development. It doesn't just have to be about encouraging the private market, although that's critically important. And so I mentioned disposition earlier, and that redevelopment authorities can acquire land and then dispose of that land, and where the redevelopment authorities can have a more direct role in actual production of housing is in the disposition agreements with developers. So disposing of the land to developers specifically for affordable housing, could be market rate housing for that community, could also be affordable housing. Direct partnerships with the developers using that disposition. You can also hire, if, for example, the redevelopment authority wishes to keep that land, so it keeps control. Perhaps it's getting lease payments that help support its own operational activities. It can keep the land, hire a developer directly while retaining control of the property, and have that developer produce housing or mixed use, including housing. You would need a sophisticated developer. You would also need a sophisticated project manager on the redevelopment authority's side to understand how to do that. Regulatory controls remain important. So this idea of partnering with city planning staff to make sure that the regulations in the urban renewal plan, whether it's design guidelines or specific uses or other specific requirements, match with the zoning changes. And then as having those regulatory controls be design guidelines. I think having the 40R, as Lawrence did, tied in, or other state zoning programs like that tied into the urban renewal plan. And then addressing the financing stacks for developers in partnership with the city. This is something I mentioned, district improvement financing with both Quincy and Brockton have used quite well. I've not worked specifically on the Quincy, but projects, but I'm familiar with what we've seen happen with that. And then using other state programs like HDIP, which addresses market rate housing specifically in gateway cities, which I did as a later project with Lawrence, and the UCH TIF or UCTIF, which is housing and commercial development and can include affordable housing. Worked on that with Lowell as well. So I think Brockton has used this idea of layering the different state and local programs on top of each other to incentivize private development. These can work well as targets for housing. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Christine and Ethel.
Thank you, Emily, for sharing that. And I'm going to actually take questions from the audience, since that's a lot of content that Emily just went over. And then before we move on to Ethel. So we have a question from Catherine Fierick, who's from Attleboro. She asks, do these plans include a vulnerability analysis with respect to flooding, sea level rise? What solutions did you have for properties in floodplains or floodways?
I'm delighted to have that question. And the reason I'm smiling is because quite a few of the plans that I've done include some form of climate change analysis or component. So quickly with Lawrence, it's a riverine community. So sea level rise wasn't a problem, but CSO, combined sewer overflows, and flooding from the river were both issues. So in that case, the development standards that were put in addressed how new development would mitigate or adapt to climate change. That plan was done or approved in 2016, and a lot has changed since then about how we think of climate change. And I think that's reflected in some of the later plans. Fall River, the downtown and the waterfront both see less so on the downtown because it's actually quite elevated. But in terms of the waterfront, there were some flooding issues, and the analysis we did put the anticipated buildings that moved them out of the floodplain and also out of the Chapter 91 restrictions in that particular area. They had sufficient land to be able to do that. In all of the projects we've looked at, addressing heat island impact came into play in terms of making sure that we started adding street trees. Lawrence actually has an innovative part of their urban renewal plan tying the payments for street trees in an area that doesn't really allow them, or and spreading those payments into the neighborhoods. I've also been working on urban renewal plans in New Bedford. That's tied, as you would expect, with sea level rise, and again, development standards coming into that. And then in both plans in Brockton, the idea that Trout Brook and Lovett Brook, with their associated wetlands, can act as stormwater storage for the intercity flooding that would happen there, and making sure that we allow for stormwater management in those areas. Trout Brook in particular floods more than Lovett, and so we actually have some properties that have seen repetitive loss. Those are identified as properties to be acquired, and the idea would be to change that land to not be built on, to allow for stormwater storage, and then move the areas that can be built on, make sure those are not in the floodplain.
Great, that's a very comprehensive response, Emily. And we have a question from Laura, our director for the assistance, Laura Schufel. She asks, what regulations regarding public construction laws are redevelopment authorities required to comply with?
That is an excellent question. I am really sorry, I don't know the answer to that. The penalties of being the planner as opposed to the person who's implemented, I have not spent a lot of time on that portion of it. So I'm more at the beginning part of it, but I could certainly look into that and talk to some of my colleagues at the various redevelopment authorities I've worked with and find out that answer.
Thank you, Emily. And perhaps Laura might be able to address some of that at our second session. And I had a question about, so Emily, earlier you had spoken to the ability of redevelopment authorities to use the disposition process to negotiate for more affordability. Can you provide some specific examples where cities have been successfully doing that for deeper affordability?
That's an interesting question. And I'm hesitating on that because in many cases, the projects that I've worked on to date have been more about market rate housing rather than affordable housing, because they've been trying to diversify the mix of incomes in the gateway cities that I've worked in. But in understanding how the disposition agreements work and how urban renewal plans work, there's a section in there where in an urban renewal plan where you specify developer obligations, in terms of the properties that the redevelopment authority would dispose of, whether by sale or purchase. And what I would say is for those communities that are looking to address affordability, that's the section in the urban renewal plan where you would lay out the levels of affordability that you're looking for. Again, I don't have to tell you that certainly for those of you who are within the Boston metro region area and your area median income is dependent on that, what's affordable with a capital A is not necessarily affordable to your residents. And so one of the things I've been talking about clients recently, not in the urban renewal plan side, but working with a client who's disposing of land, is talking about what levels of affordability make sense for that community. Is it 30%? Is it 110%? Where is it in terms of AMI? I would say documenting that in the urban renewal plan is the first step. And then as you write your letters of, of agreement with the developers, making sure that that's part of those letters, that it's clear your expectation that they meet that level of affordability in their projects is critically important.
Great, thank you. That's great advice. And I had another question for you. In terms of staffing a redevelopment authority, you've seen a range of different types of redevelopment authority and how they function in their respective communities. Do you have any perhaps best practices just from your experience, what the best way is to staff a redevelopment authority, specifically separating the city's executives and planning staff from the redevelopment authority so they have more autonomy and independence from the decisions that are more tied with the elected executive?
I think that's a good question. I have seen a range of different models, from those who are very much integrated with the city to those who have their own staff and then work with a separate city's planning staff. There definitely has to be overlap between the two of them in terms of collaboration and, in terms of redevelopment authority staff and city planning staff, because both entities are doing planning, they are doing implementation. I think where the more successful models that I've seen is where the redevelopment authority has sufficient staffing of its own that is also versed in how development works. City planning staff, as you all know, have very specific roles in terms of who they need to report to and the types of things that move into through cities, whether it's dealing with planning boards or community development boards, ZBA, responding to city council, doing their own planning work, for the appropriate level of planning in the city. The redevelopment authority's focus is more narrow. And it is more tied to the development. So making sure that the staffing that's available for that includes project managers, one or more, depending on the size of the city and the redevelopment authority, who can see that construction project really from start to beginning, as well as the more general planning staff, I think is important.
Thank you. And I'm going to take one more question from Catherine before we move on to Atel. She has a follow-up question. Other than Cdbg, what other sources of revenue can help a redevelopment authority staff up?
So, excellent question. I mentioned keeping land earlier and disposing of it by lease. There's been a couple of models. I did about, I think 4 or 5 years ago, maybe more now, I did actually a sort of personal review of all the redevelopment authorities that I could find in Massachusetts and who was doing what. And I noticed a lot of them are working as parking authorities. And so they have a garage. I know Fall River, for example, has a garage. There are a couple of others out there, and they're using that parking revenue can be a source of income, but also acquiring land. So, for example, you mentioned staffing up, acquiring city land, for example, that has been taken by tax lien or has just been around, developing that, but rather than disposing of the land, using a lease format. So the lease income comes back in, and that can be a source of revenue. I know of 2 redevelopment authorities that have office parks where they continue to own the office park, and they have leased funding coming in to support projects. And then, that becomes operating funds that could allow for additional staffing. So that's one way of doing that. Obviously, the normal grant programs are primarily for construction rather than operating. So it does become a tricky question.
Okay, thank you, Emily. And if anyone has any more questions for Emily, please put them in the chat, and then we will get to them after Atel finishes up with her presentation, and we'll take questions for both panelists. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Attell. Have her
Thank
share
you.
her screen.
Thank you. And it's, you can see it on the screen.
Yep.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you, Christine and Emily. I could listen to you for hours. This is such good information. And just want to say a special thank you to MHP too. I know Shelley came to Worcester just a few months ago to talk to us about the newly launched Affordable Housing Trust Fund. It's been a really good resource for us activists and organizers on the ground. So I decided to title the short presentation Organizing for Inclusive Development because that's been a current theme that housing and activists on the ground in Worcester have talked a lot, especially since the Polar Park development in our city. So just for some background, we're the second largest city in New England with over 200,000 residents, which is an increase of 14% from 10 years ago, according to the latest census. Worcester's diversity, it's our strength, in my opinion. There's over 90 languages spoken here, multiracial, multi-ethnic community. We're also known as a refugee resettlement city. With Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, we welcomed our siblings from Puerto Rico and really became a haven of support for housing and resettling folks. But we're also seeing, in addition to other refugee communities, we're also welcoming our Afghan refugees in our community. Worcester, despite the most recent developments and being such an attractive city for developers, it still remains, in a lot of people's opinions, including mine, out of reach. I started with the quote from Daisy. I don't know if I can afford to live in the city anymore. For context, during the pandemic, a few organizations like Central Mass Housing Alliance and others got together and specifically looked at how the pandemic was affecting families and residents who, for one reason or the other, were falling through the cracks. Daisy was one of the essential workers who was living in a different shelter at the time. And I oversaw, through private funds and with the help of these organizations, the siting of a shelter, temporary shelter in a hotel for 14 households. We sheltered them for about 3 months. And Daisy was one of the folks that we struggled really, really hard to house because there simply wasn't any affordable housing. And obviously, with the eviction happening, folks weren't moving, and there were no options for people like Daisy. And I remember still that quote because I spent weeks talking to Daisy and other families in that hotel, trying to figure out what their options were going to be. We also saw in Worcester a number of unsheltered individuals increase. These are folks that, for one reason or the other, choose to remain unhoused because the conditions in our shelters are not exactly, it doesn't fit their needs, or actually during the pandemic, a lot of folks would rather stay out in encampments versus going into shelter because it was so taxing and so scary to be in a congregate setting where COVID-19 numbers spiked. We also saw spiking families and individuals facing eviction and experiencing housing instability. In my daily job, I lead efforts to increase affordable housing in Worcester, to talk about how we eradicate homelessness, not just prevent it. And my job really pivoted in the last year to hands and feet on the ground, trying to really understand how do we make sure that we talk about all these issues, not just in terms of prevention, but to talk about them in human terms. And people like Daisy really helped us craft a narrative for our local decision makers to understand that the first step is creating more housing and having more holistic approaches. I put here some numbers from the Low Income Housing Coalition Out of Reach report, which shows that Worcester still remains out of reach for low wage earners, essential workers like Daisy, those on fixed income. Those are all folks that I get emails, calls every day, obviously. And even, we're talking about even moms, pregnant moms with their babies and children literally living in their cars because they really can't find not just shelter, but any housing options. To put it into perspective, the fair market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in Worcester is currently $1,450. In order to afford this rent with utilities without paying more than 50% of somebody's income, a household needs to earn $27 an hour. for perspective, the average wage of renters in Worcester and surrounding areas is only 14 an hour. And so for somebody to be able to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment at this average renter wage, somebody would need to work 77 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. And why that's important for our context is that, we hear about affordability and housing and market rate and luxury housing. And, as Inez was mentioning, what really means affordable and to whom is a critical question in any decision making, especially around housing. And I know from not just talking to people, but from the work that I do, that there's a huge population in Worcester that's really finding it extremely unaffordable to live and find housing here. So there's been a ton of developments in Worcester, starting with the, Inez talked about the urban renewal. For us, it's the City Square $565 million project, private and public development that also includes now the home of the Worcester Red Sox, as they call it. And so we've seen a ton of new developments. We've seen a lot of investors and developers taking an interest in the city. I know there's some folks here from the TOPA Coalition who have done amazing work in giving us some data around what's also happening with investors that are swooping in to buy multifamily units with cash and turning them up for profit. So one interesting spike that we saw in the last year that connects to that is that in addition to evictions as a result of non-payment, we've actually seen an increase in no-fault evictions. And these are residents that are being displaced because multifamily units are so attractive to cash developers that they're buying them and turning them up for profit, either raising rents or simply evicting people and displacing them so that they can turn them into luxury housing. And so thanks to the TOPA Coalition, we've seen, for example, upwards of 200 of those investments, many of whom are bought in cash. And so that has been reflected in some of the numbers we've seen. The Polar Park, which is 159 or a little bit more million project, was completed in April of this year. Brought with it 228 market rate housing units. Not exactly super helpful to the folks that we work with, not only those experiencing homelessness, but especially low-wage earners and folks that are really just trying to live day by day. Table Talk Pies is touted as one of the few developments that has brought a few more affordable housing units. Again, those are at 60% AMI, a very few at 30% AMI, but it really is one of the very few developments that we have that we can say are sort of affordable. And I say sort of affordable because, again, we have noticed also that when folks go to apply for these apartments, they either get faced with racial discrimination or they get faced with other barriers that do not exactly make it very welcoming for them to apply. So there's definitely a lot more nuance to what really is affordable in Worcester. Polar Park has really revitalized the Canal District. It's brought mixed use, it's brought retail, it's brought hotels and housing units. But again, while it's great for that area, it has also created some impact in terms of businesses, homegrown businesses no longer being able to afford to stay there or being bought out, and of course rents in the area going up. And so I want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing on the ground, specifically in the context of the ARPA funds that are coming into the city, and then the community benefits agreement for the Polar Park. So in 2018, I was part of the Worcester Community Labor Coalition. This is a coalition between labor and community residents and organizations that really focused on creating a strong community benefit agreement for the Polar Park and its ancillary developments. This group of folks worked for over a year to work with the city and the developers. Can't say that we really got a super strong community benefit agreement. One of the key points in that community benefit agreement, one of the key asks was to include mitigating efforts or solutions towards to prevent homelessness in that area, as well as to mitigate any displacement. We included asks for affordable housing. We included asks for to support organizations that do homelessness prevention work. and especially at least to start with a 15 an hour for workers in the hotel and retail shops. Depending on who you ask, the community benefit agreement didn't really include a lot of these asks, definitely not affordable housing. And we're still struggling to get one of its developers, Medicine Properties, to come to the table and give us a commitment to pay workers at least 15 an hour. And even that, it's not enough to be able to afford a family sustaining wage. The city did, however, make Cdbg funding available for low-income homeowners in that area to mitigate some of the issues that of gentrification that residents brought up. Not really sure because we really don't really know how many homeowners actually took advantage of it. And part of it is in some of the community meetings that were held is that that process in of itself can be quite taxing, can be very difficult to navigate. And I know that the city staff work really hard, but those departments, like it was mentioned before, are extremely understaffed, and the staff are trying their best to really help residents navigate the complicated process and the bureaucracy. Despite some of the affordable housing units in that area of the Canal District, which is home of the Polar Park, that have been preserved, and also some have been created, I definitely think, and I'm not alone in thinking, that the Worcester has a gap in safe and affordable housing creation and preservation. And I think the issue of climate change and energy retrofits has come up a lot in some of the organizing that I'll talk to you about. But it goes without saying that it seems like, at least in our case, sometimes we talk about housing incomplete as being divorced from climate change and urban heat islands effects and energy retrofits. And we're really trying as housing advocates to marry those two and to create a holistic message when we talk about safe and affordable housing. The other thing that I want to say is that the city of Worcester has spent a lot of time, to their credit, in investing in lead remediation. However, we see, for example, in our families that come out of shelter, that they're often, and others as well, they're often forced to live in substandard housing where lead is not the only issue, but you get mold and you get, we're talking about energy retrofits, homes that are not weatherized. And so there's definitely a lot more that we can do with the ARPA dollars to address some of those issues. So what we did is, as soon as we started talking as a community around the ARPA dollars and what we're going to do with it, we put together a coalition called Worcester Together Affordable Housing Coalition, which is being co-led by myself and another colleague. We took the lead in doing that because we felt as though, for those of us who do the work on the ground, we know what's best. We know what the gaps are. And we actually, during the pandemic, have been, as I mentioned before, hands-on, really trying to uncover and talk more about the housing crisis from a different perspective. And so the city of Worcester is receiving over $146 million in ARPA, state designated and federal funds, and to help communities disproportionately impacted by COVID. What we know for sure, without any doubt, is that during the pandemic, especially in densely housed areas that tend to also be the poorest areas of the city, tend to also be where most communities of color are segregated, as well as low-income communities, that the convergence of COVID and the housing crisis sort of created quite a collision of an intersection of racial inequality as well. Not just from a renter's perspective, we know that, for example, the Worcester Business Journal and the Worcester Research Bureau did a recent study that uncovered, and I say uncovered, this is not really new to any of us on the ground, but for the general public, that talked about the racial inequalities and barriers among homeowners of color. And so we wanted to make sure that in our organizing with the Worcester Together Affordable Housing Coalition, that we talked about that this fund that we're trying to be allocated to creating and preserving affordable housing, the 20%, it's primarily focused on communities of color, Black and Brown and low-income communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And so we stuck with the 20% of all ARPA funds to go towards creating and preserving affordable housing and creating homeownership opportunities, because we felt as though we needed a rallying cry around the fact that we need to address this once in a lifetime opportunity that we have to address. the housing crisis. So we gathered the support of 42 local organizations. We try to be very diverse and sort of make our table a little bit bigger, including anchor institutions like UMass Memorial and others, including some labor folks who we really wanted to show that housing, it's not just a rallying cry of housing advocates on the ground. It really should be a community-wide concern. I know I mentioned Shelley came and talked to us about the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which the city managed to its credit established. And we focused on also talking about the fact that the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is an excellent opportunity for us to use and fund through some of the monies through the ARPA funds. We talked about Community Preservation Act as a source of funding for this newly Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And just last week, we were able to get the Econ Development Subcommittee of the Worcester City Council to revise its ordinance and increase the numbers of tenants or folks with lived experience from 1 to 2. And while that may seem not a huge win, the fact that we were able to coalesce this amount of organizations and just even increase the number of folks with lived experience in a newly established fund felt like a big win to us, and I'm going to celebrate even if it's small. So we're super excited about that as a coalition, and I believe that's my last slide. But let me stop sharing and just add that one of the most exciting things and opportunities that I feel for housing at least is that we're on the heels of just having newly elected progressive voices on Worcester City Council. We made sure that we made that the 20% ask in housing, as I say, not a dirty word in Worcester. And so while we expect to receive opposition, while we expect to have folks that may be scared of having more affordable housing and talking about zoning changes and talking about how we need to absolutely make sure we're not segregating housing in areas of the city that have been traditionally underserved. It's an opportunity for us to talk about housing and our needs in a different way. And so we're trying really hard with the Affordable Housing Coalition to include things like energy retrofits, to talk about labor, to talk about when possible to have things like community benefit agreements for new developments, to talk about tax increment financing and making sure that, for example, for public projects that receive or private projects that receive taxpayer dollars, that there's transparency around the number of hires for both Black, Brown, and women, as well as supporting our small businesses. And those are some of the things that we're pushing for in terms of beyond housing, on how to have a more holistic conversation around all these things. So let me pause there and see if folks have any questions.
Thank you, Atal. We have about 5 minutes before we go into a transition break, but we have a couple of questions that came in from attendees. First, from John. He asked, what can be done to preserve and create affordable housing as gateway cities emerge from their multi-generational cycles of disinvestment? And Emily, you're welcome to join us to answer this as well.
Well, I mean, I can talk about what we have pushed for, at least with the ARPA funds. We actually were able to secure a meeting with the city manager. We're going to meet with him next Monday, and we put together a proposal that we think addresses that question. And part of that proposal is that there's estimated 2,000 units in Worcester that are expected to come online. So part of what's not happening in that conversation, at least publicly, is that those units are going to need quite a bit of work beyond remediation. And so we've been talking about how do we incorporate energy retrofits, deep energy retrofits? How do we create a revolving loan fund for homeowners, low-income homeowners who can take advantage of that funding, and then, obviously attached to some deep affordability? I believe ARPA, I'm not sure. Maybe Emily, you might know the answer, or somebody else, but there's at least a 10-year or maybe more affordability restriction. And so while that's not ideal, we're hoping that at least we're able to preserve more units. On the others, and Emily talked a lot about acquisition of properties. There are vacant lands in Worcester that we would love to turn into mixed income housing. And having a diversity of portfolio is important. But, John, as you know, we've worked really hard to get some of our elected officials to support TOPA. That would have been an amazing legislation if enacted by municipalities to do exactly that, to preserve some of these multifamily units that are going into the hands of investors that don't have a special or an interest in preserving affordability for community members.
And I'll just add that, I touched a lot of the projects that I've done so far have been quite large scale. I'm actually starting a new urban renewal plan for Fall River, kicking off within the next month or so. That's going to be focused on many of the strategies that Edel just talked about in terms of smaller scale direct intervention. And so I'll be interested to see how that turns out. But certainly the idea of the substandard housing is something that it's part of the definition of a blighted area. And so redevelopment authorities have this direct ability to assess that level of substandard, and this idea that it's lead is something that I've talked about, but I think adding on top of that the energy efficiency, especially as we move into climate change, becomes more and more important. And so these smaller scale strategies of how do we address existing housing and bring that up to levels of standards, as well as adding new housing, I think to the ability of the redevelopment authority to combine these grants and loans and other programs, and how to directly impact, for example, the ability to address rising rents, to avoid displacement, their ability to follow state requirements, federal requirements for relocation while work is being done. All of these are really useful tools for addressing many of the conditions that Edel just talked about.
I'm going to quickly add to that and just encourage any cities that have a redevelopment authority to push them to be more aggressive in their asks when there's more commercial investment, to really ask for that inclusive housing in any component that has housing, ask for more affordable housing. And I think that we all know this, but a lot of the people who work in our service industries don't make enough, as Edel just said, don't make enough to actually live in the communities that they work in or serve in. So having that coupling of private investment with the affordable component is really important. And I'll just share a really quick story because I live in Salem, and we just went through a really banner year of October here in Salem, and right in the middle of downtown, it's a legacy of urban renewal back in the 70s, where there's a huge parking lot in the middle of downtown. And that was an entire neighborhood that was demolished to make way for parking. And next to it is a mall with a parking garage that is not in great shape. So in the name of urban renewal, 2 neighborhoods were demolished to eliminate quote unquote blight. But these 2 parcels today are the most blighted areas, I would argue, of downtown. So I think when redevelopment authorities think about reinvesting in these areas, really have to think about who else are we including when we create jobs, and not just create jobs for people to come work at these jobs, but also bringing people to be able to live here and work here and not be able to get in the car to go everywhere. And I think the coupling of those, like Tal said earlier, is really, really important.
I could also have a long conversation with you about the role of urban redevelopment authorities today in historic preservation. That's certainly something. In Salem, we looked at Lawrence and Fall River as well, in terms of using what's existing there and rehabilitating it, not removing it.
Absolutely. And I'm going to take Catherine's question really quick before we move on to the transition break. She asked, with funds like Cdbg, are there ways to ensure that benefits flow from landlord to renter? Any way to include provisions where landlords cannot raise rents above a given amount within the 5 to 10 year period? Great question.
I can talk about one. We just actually, some of us were just working to save a super affordable multifamily unit that was just cited for code violations. And the first question that we asked to the city director is, did code talk to you about how this landlord could have used CDBG monies to address some of the code violations and also just retrofits? And he said no. And I said, well, that's a problem, that if the code is not talking to connecting landlords to these resources. And so when we asked that question, the response was about the CDBG. Yes, and that's partly why some homeowners or landlords will not want to have CDBG funds. A, because it's a taxing process and it takes a long time, but most importantly, because it does come with strings attached. And most of them, especially at this time, are not really interested in participating in that process.
And Christine, just to follow up very quickly on an earlier question that Laura asked, I know she may give more information in her own piece, but redevelopment authorities are not completely bound by 30B. They have different provisions under 30B as to how they can procure different services and contractors and dispose of land. So I just wanted to put that out there. That may be what you were asking, Laura. I wasn't sure.
It was, thank you.
You're welcome.
Christine, can I ask one question? Sorry.
Sure. Go ahead, Laura.
Emily, in your experience, do the redevelopment authorities have in their meetings, and are they ever advocated? Do they ever people lobby them, or how much public input do they is involved in a redevelopment plan? I guess is kind of my question.
So that is a great question. And one of the changes to the original enabling legislation was to add public input as a component of an urban renewal plan. And so that we're required as we develop it to have various touch points. As you can imagine, for those of the plans, I think the one that I'm doing for the master plan, for the land use plan rather, for Lovett Brook, is the only one that was developed during COVID. So that's been an interesting challenge for us. But all of the others had not just the approval process, which is a public approval process and has to go through the redevelopment authority, the planning board, and the city council. So that's all public, but we had public meetings prior to that at various stages of the plan to discuss the visioning, the how this works, the what could it be, and get public input. That's all required. To answer the question about the redevelopment authorities, I have not seen the public at redevelopment authorities sort of advocating within that. That doesn't mean that they couldn't. It's just I haven't seen it to date. I have certainly been at city council meetings where people have asked questions about the plan, but that is at the hearing stage. And so I would strongly encourage you, especially given that redevelopment plans are happening in these areas that are frequently EJ communities, have the substandard, the are blighted areas, and these are not always communities that are happy to be part of government discussions or attend government meetings. So really being creative about how you reach out to those communities. And it's an ongoing process. No process is ever perfect. But Laura, that's an important component of urban renewal these days.
If I can add 2 seconds to that, we one of the few meetings I think that we saw a little bit more public participation in front of the Worcester Development Authority, when there was talk about taking a mall downtown by eminent domain potentially because of the structural issues and et cetera. And part of the discussion was that that mall was sort of an incubator for mostly people of color owned businesses and immigrant owned businesses. And so a few of us showed up, and I can tell you, I've been following council meetings and public meetings for a long time. It was very, very hard for a regular resident to appear in front of a body that speaks in jargon or that's really hard to participate. And so it just ends up being the same actors, so to speak, that show up to these meetings, and regular residents that are disconnected from regular government processes. tend to not make it for the same reasons that Emily said. But I can't say that we were successful in successfully lobbying against them, sort of pumping the brakes.
The Lawrence Redevelopment Authority did a fantastic job of reaching out to the community. They really took it upon themselves to, beyond the stuff that I as a consultant was scoped to do in terms of public meetings, they collectively and their citizens advisory group really went out into the community and spread the message. And that's a great model. I'm happy to talk to anybody about how they did that.
For all that insight, Atal and Emily, and thank you again for joining us this morning. We are going to take a quick transition break to get ready for session 2, and Laura, our very own Laura Schufel, will be talking about leveraging public land for affordable housing. So please stick around. We'll be back in 5 minutes. So at 11:08, we'll return. All right. See you guys very soon. I'm going to keep the video on, but feel free to go take a break, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, everybody, it is 11:08, and we are returning to session 2. And for session 2, we have MHP's Director of Community Assistance, Laura Schufel. I'm going to quickly introduce her and have Laura take over for her presentation. Laura Schufel is one of the most experienced housing professionals in Massachusetts, knowledgeable on a wide range of issues and practices, including proper and effective use of public funds and land, housing lotteries, fair housing, housing authority development, and the State Comprehensive Land Use Permit Law, or known as Chapter 40B. At MHP, Laura's responsibilities include providing pre-development, development, and strategic planning, technical assistance to municipalities, housing authorities, and other appropriate organizations, building relationships and providing training on affordable housing to town officials, volunteer boards, nonprofits, and housing professionals, managing MHP's 40B technical assistance program, and representing MHP and its policy agenda on relevant state and regional affordable housing committees. And we're so glad to have Laura join us for this session. And I'm going to be sharing my screen to pull up Laura's slides. Give me 1 second. All right. Take it away, Laura.
All right, thank you, Christine. That was a great introduction. And I want to thank Emily and Atal for a great first session. It was terrific. So for about 25 years, MHP has been assisting municipalities and housing authorities to dispose of land and buildings to a developer to produce affordable housing. In that time, MHP has been involved in developments that have yielded over 60 in 60 municipalities and have yielded over 3,800 units. Go ahead to the next step. So my goals for today are to provide you with an overview of the steps necessary to find, assess, build support for, and prepare to dispose of public property for affordable housing. And also to explain and point out some red flags that have come to light in the process recently. I'll sprinkle some successful projects throughout the presentation and leave some project profiles for last to get you to think about what you might be able to do in your city. In this slide, we have the Blanchard School in Uxbridge before and after. It resulted in 25 family units and a terrific improvement over the blighted former school that was sitting empty for decades. Next. So the first question to ask is, why use public property? There's many answers, but most municipalities find making public property available for development is one of the most proactive ways they can address the housing needs of their community. while also helping to shape what the project will become. Repurposing vacant buildings, especially schools, that have been a popular and successful way to address the housing needs of a community. Tax title properties, either failed developments, abandoned buildings, or random lots and empty homes, can be a way to start small in developing a policy to use public property for affordable housing. And last on my list, but certainly not last, is to redevelop blighted areas, either through an urban development project like Emily described, a receivership program, or acquisition. This picture is the McElwain School in Bridgewater, which just had a groundbreaking to begin to transfer the historic school and some new construction into 57 units, with 51 affordable between 30 and 60% of an area median income. Next. So where can you find out what's available in your city? The City Department of Planning or Community Development Department is a good place to start. If there's a housing production plan, it should have a list of potential sites for development. If not, the assessor may be able to produce a list of all city-owned property. That list would be a raw list, which will include everything the city owns and is currently using, as well as what's abandoned. So it'll take some time to pare down. But if that's all you can find, it's a way to start. The state also has surplus land that may be attainable. This picture, I could probably spend the whole session talking about this project. I'll just give you the highlights. This is Lyman Terrace in Holyoke. It's a redevelopment of a federal public housing development that was destined to be demolished and instead was redeveloped. You can see the bump outs to add space to the units and build the community and keep the community there that had been living there for generations. There's a total of 166 units in 2 phases. Next. Okay, so you've gone to the Community Development Department or the assessor or GIS or somewhere, and you now have a list. What comes next? So the process for moving forward with identifying and prioritizing properties for disposition will be different if it's driven by staff with mayoral or town council and manager support, or if it's being driven from an appointed committee or by advocates. If it's staff-driven, the properties may be evaluated by other city staff, like DPW, engineers, conservation, water department, for suitability and feasibility. If it's an appointed committee, it'll be important for the committee to advocate with the administration to support the evaluation of the properties, either with staff, third-party consultants, or MHP. If not with staff, and the committee would be hiring third-party consultants, there needs to be funds found to pay for the due diligence. And if it's advocates, lobbying the administration and maybe the city council to get support and possibly dedicate funds to evaluate the properties will be important. This property here is actually a rendering of what this property will be. It is the former William Barton School in Hyde Park, soon to be the Pride Apartments. It'll be 74 units of senior housing for seniors between 30% of AMI and 100% of AMI. There'll also be community space in the former auditorium, and it's the first Massachusetts development that is LGBTQ friendly for seniors. Next. All right, so again, you have this list. What comes next? You've pared the list down. Now you have to evaluate the properties for suitability and feasibility. Looking at, are the utilities readily available? Is the infrastructure able to support a development? Or what size development could they support without a big influx of funds? Are there wetlands or other physical constraints? Are hazardous materials a concern on the site of the building? Oftentimes, buildings are historic and they're full of asbestos or lead. Is the building going to be remodeled, rehabbed, or demolished? A lot of times that comes down to how much historic significance there is in the building, and also how much remediation would have to be done if there are hazardous materials. Next. So now you've looked at your list, you've narrowed it down, you've done some initial feasibility. Now you have to designate the property for disposition or transfer it to the Redevelopment Authority or a municipal affordable housing trust. That's the first step in disposition. The process for disposition varies from city to city depending on the charter. In most cases, the administrative branch, which is the select board, mayor, or the town manager, votes to recommend the disposition to the legislative branch, who is town meeting or the city or town council. Once that is done, they will vote to dispose, and also if there's any use restrictions, it has to be declared at that time. So typically there's a warrant article or a ordinance request to dispose of the property with affordability restrictions, or for community housing, or for affordable housing. It's best to be broad in the definition in order to make the project feasible moving on, and also to satisfy the needs of the community. If the property is transferred to the Redevelopment Authority or the Affordable Housing Trust, there are various ways to do that, and you'd have to look at the town or city charter to see that. Many times the mayor or the administrative branch has the authority to transfer, but that isn't also always the case. Okay, next. So why dispose of the property? Why not just have your housing authority or your planning staff or your community development staff develop the property and maintain the property in the public entity? The main reason is the additional cost that a public entity is subject to. Chapter 149, the public construction laws, it's estimated adds an additional 25 to 30% to the cost of development. Excuse me. Since most affordable housing developments cost between $400,000 and $500,000 per unit without public construction costs, and they have to rely on a multitude of subsidies, any development with the added 30% is financially infeasible. There just isn't enough subsidy to fill the gap unless the local entity, the city, has funds that they can contribute to fill the gap. Other reasons besides the cost, the complexity of financing, public management of private housing. Does the city really want to be a landlord? There's also the question of financial risk and liability. Again, is this something the city wants to take on? And who's going to manage and maintain the property? Under the procurement law, chapter 30B, all goods and services would be subject to procurement, adding cost and complexity, especially if you're talking about managing a property. Lack of staff capacity is another concern. And then there's also political implications of supporting a city-owned property that that could have issues in the future if it goes over budget or rents don't meet the expenses. all those things come into play. So most folks determine that the best course of action is to dispose of the property. In this picture is a depiction of the Wells School in Southbridge, which will be 49 senior units, all below 60% of AMI. So the disposition of real property is governed by Chapter 30B, which is overseen by the Inspector General's office. The regulations are summarized in the Inspector General's manual, which is available online. It's really a summary with basic information about the regulations and components of an RFP and the advertising requirements. It doesn't get into the details that around preferences and requirements, but it is a helpful tool. The Inspector General's office also offers trainings specifically on the acquisition and disposition of real property. And those trainings are listed on the Inspector General's website. And they're dry, but they're not as dry as they sound. I've been to them a couple times. So when for real property disposition, according to Chapter 30B, if the property is worth more than $35,000, then it requires a solicitation, either through an invitation for bids, an IFB, or a request for proposals, which we always shorten to RFP. An IFP is used when the disposition is a simple sale. So it goes to the highest bidder. The solicitation of an IFP describes the property and requires a sealed bid that's opened at a determined time, and the highest bidder then negotiates a purchase and sale. A request for proposal is used for all other dispositions. An RFP has multiple components, which include a comparative evaluation criteria that are used to score the proposals. Next. Site feasibility and due diligence. The goal of a disposition is to get the best development that meets the needs and preferences of the city. In order to do that, there needs to be some investigation of the property and to give potential proposers enough information that they're willing to spend the money it takes to put a proposal together. I've heard estimates from developers that it's anywhere between $30,000 and $50,000 to put these together and submit a proposal. So any work that can be done up front gives developers more confidence that the project will move forward if they're awarded it. So some of the work for due diligence and site feasibility may be done prior to declaring the property for disposition, as I stated before. That's to be sure there's clear title and a preliminary evaluation on development constraints, and maybe a look at how many units can fit on the site or in the building. The site due diligence listed on the slide, title, survey, existing plans, utility access and availability, and identification of constraints should be done before drafting the request for proposals for a developer. If it's an existing building, especially historic, and there's a concern of hazardous materials, then an environmental study should also be included. MHP's community assistance team can help with pre-development due diligence and drafting a request for proposals. Next. Building community support. I really didn't know where to put this slide. It really comes up throughout the whole process and should be started early, preferably before you even have a site chosen. That being said, I threw it in here, and because once you have a site, then the real work starts for building community support. So begin early. You should message the need for housing, the needs in your community, but always lead with people. Who can't live here if we don't increase the supply of affordable housing? Who will have to move? What services are going to be lost? How long is the line going to be at the deli counter? All those things matter to people. Can their children afford to stay in the community? So those, you should hold community engagement sessions throughout the process. You could consider both in-person and web-based platforms to survey opinions. The web-based platforms have been very successful in bringing folks into the process, even though they are doing it at home on their computer. It's definitely broadened the reach of community engagement. I would caution against charrettes and visual preference surveys. Since the design cannot be prescribed and only broad guidelines can be used, both charrettes and visual surveys raise the expectation of residents that they can design the project with requirements that can make it infeasible or at a size that isn't scaled enough. And these folks are from, the folks in the slide are from supporting Revere's Affordable Housing Trust. Shout out to Shelley, thanks. Next. So there are red flags in RFP. I kind of alluded to it early that the process is a little inconsistent right now. Recent bid protest decisions by the Attorney General have raised red flags around the requirements and control of the development when disposing of public property. The decisions identify a number of factors that can contribute to requiring compliance with the public construction law, even when disposing to a private entity. These decisions contradict guidance and opinions that have been historically relied upon. I'll note some of the factors in the next few slides. Drafting the RFP. I've listed some of the components and decisions to be made while drafting the RFP. The decision to lease or sell typically tips to lease when public entities are given the choice. However, having a leasehold has been identified by the Attorney General as one of the factors that could tip the project to be required to do public construction, as well as making a decision on how the conveyance is going to move forward. There needs to be property description. Usually that includes the locus, the history of the site, the deed information, where it is, how it's accessed, and then there's supporting documents that are included as attachments to the RFP. And those are usually locus maps, surveys, deeds, and any site due diligence that's been done. There also needs to be an explanation of the use restrictions. So the use restrictions are the affordability restrictions in the cases we're talking about. The use restrictions give the project a public purpose, and that allows the public entity to convey it for less than market price or less than a market lease. Next. Included in the RFP are also detailed requirements and preferences of the community. As I stated before, designs can't be too prescriptive. So getting an architect involved usually does not make sense. Broad design guidelines are acceptable. Talking about the local vernacular, meeting the local vernacular, height limitations, maybe that you want multiple buildings, but a limit on how many buildings. And those also preferred amenities. Let's see. I think my slides got messed up. Can also be there. Management can't be required to be a public entity. Public entities can approve or have oversight of construction. So if there's inspections beyond standard practice, that would be frowned upon. They can't have oversight of management, tenant selection, or funding. Okay, next. Red flags also are the contract terms and requirements. The lease term has to be more than 50 years. Sometimes it's referred to as the life of the building plus 10. That usually comes out to 50 if it's new construction. Lease payments can't total the value of the land. So if you take the lease payment times annual lease payment time the term, it can't be more than the current value of the land or building. Lease or land disposition agreement. The land disposition agreement is the agreement between the award and the lease, or between the award and the sale. Sometimes it's purchase and sale. And those terms, again, can't be too controlling. No inspections, no oversight of the management, no oversight of the funding or the financing, or the financials overall of the project. There can't be a reverter clause that would have the property revert back to the public entity. And the property can't transfer back to the public entity at no or reduced cost at the end of the lease term or before the end of the lease term. Next. So how do you move forward? Currently, there's no clear regulations or directions to avoid a bid protest when disposing of public property. But MHP and others are working on defining a clear path or safe harbor to follow. For now, we'll keep our projects moving forward and avoid as many of the red flags as possible. The community assistance team is here to help. If your community is contemplating the disposition of public property, as I've already said, MHP can help. Here's our contact information. It's only up the screen for a while, but it can be found at mhp.net. Next, I'm just going to go through a couple of projects that were successful on public land through the disposition of public land. The Clarion in Boston, this is 39 family units plus almost $6,000 a square feet, 6,000 square feet of commercial space. This was basically a gathering of parcels. There was 11 parcels, 8 of which the city owned and 3 an affiliate of the developer owned, and they packaged them and put it out for disposition. And this is what it resulted in: 27 affordable below 60%, 5 at moderate income, 100%, and 7 market units. Next. This is the Carter School in Leominster. You see the theme with schools. Before, it was all boarded up and had been for quite a while, and after, it's 39 units of housing, all below 60% of AMI. Next. This one wasn't really public land, but it had a public connection, and so I thought I'd include it for those of you who have inclusionary zoning. A developer had to satisfy his inclusionary zoning requirement that he didn't want to do on-site. So he transferred this property, which was a former parking lot, fully permitted, to a local nonprofit, Harbor Light Community Partners. And this resulted in a deeply affordable 6-unit family development with 3 of the units at 30% of AMI and 3 of the units at 50% AMI. This was perfect reuse of a former parking lot. And I'll leave you with this, this Cape view, tranquil shot of the community patio at Little Pond Place in Falmouth. This had been property, including another 12 acres that the town bought for conservation and affordable housing, and put the affordable housing piece out for development, and resulted in 40 affordable rental apartments and community space. I am happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That was really great information. Even I learned something new. And I'm going to check the chat. Are there any questions? So first question from Liz. If a property is transferred to a redevelopment authority, do they need to amend their urban renewal plan to take it and or dispose of it to an affordable housing developer?
I'm not an expert on redevelopment authorities, but I believe the answer to that is yes. They do need to change their plan.
I don't think Emily is with us any longer, but we can follow up with that question for Liz.
Okay.
And oh, I see someone had helped answer that. So the question from Liz, the answer is yes, but it's generally a minor plan amendment. Emily had left that before she hopped off. Great, thank you, Emily. So Catherine from Attleboro had another question. How do you, quote unquote, sell a preference for low income or mixed income housing to stakeholders? Though leadership generally supports more affordable housing, it's hard to eliminate quick market rate development projects in RFP when the city must continue to pay insurance and heat, et cetera, on the building for years after signing a purchase and sale with affordable developers while they seek the, what's TC again?
I'm sorry, I
Tax
can't.
credit.
Oh, tax credit.
Thanks, Catherine. Well, before Laura answers, some of the components of that question we will actually be addressing for session 3 next Tuesday at 10. So any of you who are interested, please sign up. Just a quick plug for session 3 next week. Laura?
I think it's important to do it up front. So when the property is declared for disposition, that's when the use restrictions should be put in. So it only goes out for affordable housing or a majority of affordable housing, mixed income, whatever it's going to be. If that's the article that they're voting on, then there has to be affordable housing in it. And I think it starts with lobbying at that point. If it's going out and it can be anything, I agree they'll try and jump at the quickest transfer.
Thank you, Laura. So I just thought of another response to Liz earlier about the minor plan amendment. So if folks are interested in the guidelines of urban renewal plan, that's chapter 121B, as Emily had mentioned, there are different ways that you can amend your urban renewal plan. So the minor plan amendment is actually a category of amendment for the plan. So as Emily had alluded to, if you want to add parcels or take away parcels, you could go through a minor plan amendment process with DHCD. So I don't see any other questions, but if anyone has any more questions, please put them in the chat. And if not, I'm going to ask Shelley to bring up the final slide. And the community assistance team at MHP, we're always around to answer any questions. As Laura had said, we also assist with some of your land disposition plans. So we could provide assistance in that regard, but always just feel free to reach out to us to tell us your ideas of anything that you might be thinking after this session. And if there are no more questions, we're going to end today's session early and give everybody about 20 minutes back to your day. But please do sign up for our next week, third and final session of our Housing Institute for Gateway Cities. Next week, it's going to be on a Tuesday because we have Veterans Day coming up on a Thursday. So we had to move it to Tuesday, November 9th from 10 to 12 p.m. And the two topics we're going to be focusing on are, well, really just one topic. We're going to be talking about local tools for housing. So for example, inclusionary zoning, accessory dwelling units, condo conversion ordinance, land trust, housing trust. And we have invited a really great group of panelists to talk about specific details about their tools and how they adopted it in their communities. And then we have a panel discussion to hear more from advocates who have actually helped the communities facilitate adoption and shepherding some of these tools to adoption in their communities. And so it's more of an open panel discussion. We invite everyone to come to share their experience, ask their question about how we're working on this particular ordinance. How do we get it through? How do we get the community buy-in? How do we sell some of these ideas to our community? So please sign up for that. And you can go to tinyurl.com/GCHI2021. And again, for those of you who have signed up for any of our 3 sessions, you'll be getting a recap email at the end of all of our 3 sessions with all the materials and recording. And for today's recording, we will be putting that a link up very soon as well. And thank you again, everyone, for joining. And please, please, please share with your Gateway Cities colleagues or anyone who you might think could benefit from next week's session. And we will see you next week. Have a good day, everybody.